Hello class, this is Professor Wade Renando with a mini lecture about 10 to 15 minutes on colonialism in South Asia and Southeast Asia. These are going to go over topics and themes that will be on the final exam in a few days. So South Asia consists of sometimes called the subcontinent of South Asia, and it includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Bhutan, and a couple other countries. And India is the largest country in the world with a population of about 1.4 billion people. And what makes this region unique is that all of these countries in this region were formerly part of a massive British empire called the Indian colony that Great Britain ran from the 1700s to the mid-1900s. So they had this shared similar colonial past, which is unusual for most regions. So India is a country of 1.4 billion people. About 17% of the world's population is in India. It's most likely going to surpass China as the largest country in the world sometime in the next roughly 5 to 6 years. It's difficult to know exactly how many people are in India because it's hard to have an accurate census when it's such a large country. It's the largest democracy in the world, and it's very diverse culturally and religiously. The largest, most common religion is Hinduism, followed by Islam, but there's also a large Christian population as well. India covers about 1 million square miles, which is about a third the size of the continental United States. So it's fairly large, about as big as the U.S. from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Pakistan is the second largest country in the region with 207.8 million people, the fifth largest country in the world population-wise, recently overtaking Brazil. It broke away from India in 1947, shortly after India and Pakistan in this region broke away from the British. It's about a third of the size of India and has had very tense relations between itself and India over the years. There have been 3 wars between India and Pakistan since the 1940s, often over territory. So relations between these two countries have been fairly tense at times. Bangladesh is the third largest country in this region. It used to be part of Pakistan. It was formerly known as East Pakistan until 1971 it broke away from Pakistan and became its own independent country. It is also a predominantly Muslim country like Pakistan, 160 million people, and it's also very low-lying with fertile soil, but it's also very vulnerable to rising sea levels and typhoons because it is so densely populated and low-lying. And other countries in the region include Sri Lanka. This is an island nation off the southeast tip of the Indian Ocean. It had a civil war that basically was finally put an end to in 2009. And then other countries again are Bhutan and Singapore and a couple of other countries in the region. This is an area that's known for very large population growth. Population growth has slowed down recently in years, but it was known for very high explosive population growth, and Pakistan still has a fairly high fertility rate. So it's a region that's starting to slow down its population growth, but was known for very large population growth. This is a street in India during a street festival. So the contemporary geography of the religion in the area. India is mostly Hindu dominated, but there's a large Muslim minority population, especially in the north. About 150 million Muslims live in India. That's about 15% of the population. Sikhs are also a major religion, one of the largest religions in the world. It's sort of a blend between Islam and Hinduism, and there are many Sikhs that live in India, especially in northern India. And Buddhists are also common in India and in Sri Lanka. The small Christian population was often brought by missionaries during the British colonial era from the 1700s to the mid-1900s. Because of its shared British colonial history, it's very common to know English as a second language in the region. India's most common language is Hindi. Pakistan, Sri Lanka also have their own commonly spoken languages, but English is often learned as a second language and a language of diplomacy and commerce within the region. So if someone in India wanted to do business or speak to someone in Pakistan, it would be common for them to speak to each other in English. And if someone in India wanted to go to Sri Lanka or Singapore, it's often common to have English spoken as a second language for commerce, especially in diplomacy and business. So in the late Middle Ages, large Muslim populations started to move into the northern parts of India, and by the 1700s, there was a large empire called the Mughal Empire. And basically this was an empire made up of Muslim aristocrats that ruled over much of India, even though most of India was still predominantly Hindu. But this empire peaked around the 1700s, and during this time the Mughal Empire allowed certain European colonial powers to set up ports and trade posts around the perimeter of India. You can see here those little posts there are basically trading posts that were set up by the British or the Dutch or Spanish or other European colonial powers to do trade with the Mughal Empire and to have their ships get resupplied while they were conducting commerce around the world. So in the 1700s, it was predominantly run by this Muslim empire with numerous small European colonies along the outskirts of it. By the mid to late 1700s, the English and the French started to displace the Mughal Empire and started to carve up this region for themselves, the English being the most prominent. French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonists were also a major player in this region, and they competed for trading posts. India had a lot of tea and a lot of cotton that was considered some of the finest in the world. In the mid-1700s, cotton wasn't as common in the United States as it was later on. So colonial powers were jockeying for power in this region, especially for the lucrative tea and cotton trade. The Great Britain went to war with France in what is called the 7 Years' War, what we in the U.S. call the French-Indian War. That was what the American theater of this war was called. But basically after this war, the British managed to kick the French out of India and make it entirely a British colony with a couple small outposts of other countries. They did the same in Canada. The British basically defeated French colonial powers in Canada, and then the French basically seceded all of Canada to Great Britain. There's still a large French-speaking population in Quebec in Canada who are the descendants of settlers from those French persons. But this was a big war for Great Britain. It was a big victory for them where they managed to push the French out of colonies in India and North America and increasing British control of India after this war. So by 1900, much of India was a direct colony of Great Britain or an indirect colony of it. The areas in green are areas of India that were under direct British control. The areas in orange are areas that more or less had puppet governments sympathetic to the British and cooperating with the British, even though they didn't have direct control of them. So by 1900, all of the subcontinent of Asia, including India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, was more or less a colony of Great Britain. During this British colonial era, a lot of British military people set up military/resort communities kind of high up in the hills. Higher up in India, there it was cooler, there were fewer mosquitoes, and Europeans found the climate more appealing. They're less likely to get malaria. So during this period from the 1718, early 1900s, it was common to have large British towns set up high up in the mountains where it was cooler, where it was more comfortable for them to conduct the business of the colonies. So shortly after World War II, Great Britain was suffering from the end of World War II. They were bombed and damaged significantly during World War II, and India had wanted their independence. So Mahatma Gandhi became a leader of the independence movement in India. He had led independence initiatives before that, going back to the 1920s, and he basically wanted independence for India. And eventually in 1947, Great Britain, tired from fighting in World War II, didn't have the resources or the willpower to try to hold on to India, so they granted India its independence. And shortly after India broke away from Great Britain, this region split between Pakistan and India. Pakistan was predominantly Muslim and India was predominantly Hindu, so the breaking up or the partitioning of these two countries was very politically chaotic. About 14 million people, either Muslims living in India or Hindus living in Pakistan, crossed the border because they didn't want to be a religious minority in the newly created country of Pakistan or India. There was lots of violence between Hindus and Muslims during this time period, and there was a lot of sectarian violence between different religions and different groups. Mahatma Gandhi wanted to keep India and Pakistan together as one country, but that was fairly unpopular. And a Hindu nationalist named Nathur Godsen killed him, assassinated him shortly after he was elected leader of India. So this was a very chaotic time after World War II when India broke away from Great Great Britain and basically was partitioned into two larger separate countries, India and Pakistan. So South Asia today is, again, the countries that you see here that we talked about, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh being the most prominent. Nepal is a mountainous country. Its capital is Kathmandu, is the largest city in the Himalayan mountains. It's built in the largest valley in the Himalayan mountains. Bhutan is a region that is kind of isolated and focused on ecotourism, and it has a relatively small population of about 600,000. Bangladesh is fairly large and low-lying, and Sri Lanka is trying to promote itself as a tourist destination. It's a relatively poor country, but it's also encouraging Chinese investors to invest in ports and infrastructure because they like to export more of their goods and services. And the Maldives is a very large collection of very low-lying islands in the Indian Ocean that caters to tourists. The highest point of the Maldives is only about 6 or 7 feet above sea level, so it's very vulnerable to rising sea levels. So again, the country is broken up into these modern countries, but all of it was a former colony of Great Britain at one point. So Southeast Asia has a similar past when it comes to colonialism, but it wasn't completely dominated by one country like India was with Great Britain. It was colonized by the Spanish and the Dutch and the English and many different people. So Southeast Asia consists of many countries that are now part of the Asain trading pact, including Myanmar, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia is the largest country in the region. It's the fourth largest country in the world with a population of about 230 million, I believe. It's the largest Muslim population in the world, and it's the most important politically and economically in the region. So this region, Southeast Asia, was desirable to many people, including Arab and Muslim traders in the Middle Ages, and later on British and other European colonial powers, because they had a warm climate so you could grow crops all year round. It became very desirable for growing rice and wheat and harvesting rubber from rubber plants. And coconuts and tea were also common. So the nice climate made it desirable for foreigners to set up colonies for growing crops and so on. And locals worked for China or Indian supplied laborers. So when these places were colonies of Great Britain, often Chinese and Indian workers from other parts of the British Empire were brought in to work on different plantations or work as civil servants. So this is an area that's culturally diverse. It has a large Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, and Christian population. And Islam was brought in by Arab traders during the Middle Ages. Buddhism was brought in a few centuries after that. Hinduism was common in parts that bordered India. And Christianity was brought by the Spanish, specifically to the Philippines, that has a very large Christian population to this day. So very culturally and religiously diverse, and the religion was influenced often by former colonial powers and the religion that they brought to the region. So this is a region that has a very large Chinese population. Almost every country in Southeast Asia has a large Chinese minority population. In Malaysia, the Chinese population is almost a third of the overall population, and the native Malaysian population are sometimes resentful of the Chinese population. Often the Chinese are better educated, more likely to own businesses, have closer ties to mainland China, so they have connections to businesses. So occasionally, native Malaysians who speak a different language and have a different culture are resentful of the Chinese who are relative new arrivals compared to them. But it's a region that has lots of Chinese influence. You can see here, most of the Chinese that have moved to Southeast Asia are from the southeastern part of China. And there are large Chinese minorities in all of these countries, especially in Brunei, or now it's known as Myanmar, in Malaysia, and also Singapore. Singapore is a country that's predominantly Chinese as far as ethnicities go. So during the colonial era, from about the really the Spanish set up colonies in the 1500s in the Philippines, but from the 15 to the 1800s, there was a large British, French, Dutch, and Spanish population there, and Portuguese, as you can see. Almost all of the country of what is now Indonesia was formerly a colony of the Netherlands, or also known as the Dutch or Holland. So when we think of Holland, we think of a small European country and tulips and windmills and wooden shoes. But in the 1600s, it was a massive, wealthy, powerful, global imperial power that had huge holdings in Southeast Asia. And again, you can see here the British had colonies all over the world. In the 1900s, they had colonies in North America, if you consider Canada part of it, different parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and there was a saying, the sun never set on the British Empire. So massive global empire that the British had peaking in the early 1900s. So different colonial powers carved up different parts of Southeast Asia and set many of the borders that we know in this region today. So the Portuguese arrived in the 1500s, lured by spices in the Malaccan Islands. So some of the first colonists were the Spanish and the Portuguese trading spices. The Spanish had colonies in South America and Mexico, and the Spanish would sail ships from Acapulco to the Spice Islands in Spain, in the Spice Islands in the Philippines, then sail it back, move it over Mexico, and send it back to Europe. And in the late 1500s, Spain had conquered most of the Philippines and set up many churches and brought in Catholicism, which is still very prominent in the Philippines today. So the Philippines had a very prominent Spanish colonial influence there. Here are a couple of the churches in the Philippines. Spanish claimed the Philippines again in the 1570s, brought Roman Catholicism to them. The Philippines is named after King Philip of Spain from the 1500s. Southern parts of the Philippines are more Muslim and still have large Muslim populations today. So strong Spanish and Catholic influence in the Philippines. The Dutch and British again also had colonies that they set up. Europeans were able to use superior weapons to invade and colonize and take over much of this region. The British actually set up Singapore as a colony in 1819 to protect British trade in the area and to set it up as a port so British ships could resupply. So somewhat like Hong Kong was in China, Singapore was set up as a British colony and resupplying base. So shortly after World War II, during World War II, much of this region was overcome by the Japanese Imperial Empire. Then the U.S. and our allies drove the Japanese out in World War II and were able to retake much of the land. But before that, the U.S. wrestled away the Philippines from Spain during the Spanish-American War that was fought in Cuba and elsewhere. And basically the U.S. inherited the Philippines from what was the decaying Spanish Empire, and it was a de facto colony of the United States from 1898 up till World War II. So again, the U.S. lost control of the Philippines to the Japanese in World War II, were able to take it back, and then shortly after World War II, the United States gave the Philippines its independence. They have the same Independence Day we do, July 4th, and then the U.S. still has a strong military presence in the region. So the U.S. did leave Subic Bay in 1992, but now the U.S. is actually slowly increasing its military presence in the region because many Southeast Asians are concerned about the growing influence of China. So decolonization in this region happened again shortly after World War II. Britain withdrew from the different colonies they had, including Singapore, which was a British colony before the Japanese overtook it in World War II. And the Philippines again was given its independence in 1946. One of the last holdouts was France. France had colonies in Vietnam that, unlike the United States and Great Britain, they did not want to lose control of. So there was an insurrection against French colonial power in North Vietnamese, and basically the Viet Cong started pushing out the French. The U.S. at first remained neutral, but then after the French colonials more or less evacuated the area, people in the U.S. were concerned that communism could spread over North and South Vietnam and then spread throughout the region. So the U.S. got involved in the Vietnam War in the 1960s, concerned that communism could spread throughout the region. After fighting for many years and losing about 59,000 soldiers, the U.S. left Vietnam in 1973, and then the communists took over all of Vietnam by 1975. Some people thought the South Vietnamese might be able to fight without the support of the U.S. and defend themselves, but they were overpowered by the communist North Vietnamese. And to this day, Vietnam remains a communist country, although they do have closer relations with the United States because even they're concerned about the increased influence of China in the region. So even Vietnam, which is on paper a communist country, prefers almost closer ties to the U.S. than closer ties to China. So the last remnants of European colonialism in this region was the French, who withdrew in the 1950s, which led to the beginning of the Vietnam War. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Again, let me know if you have any questions about any topic related to chapters 12 or 13. Have a good day.